Before the Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage ever made headlines, everything about it looked completely unremarkable. The situation before anyone knew what was coming. There were no red flags on anyone's radar, no analysts flagging unusual activity, no reason for a single investigator to take a second look. It was, by every outward measure, business as usual. But that is precisely what makes this opening chapter so important to understand. The setup was not a dramatic turning point on its own, it was the quiet foundation everything else would eventually be built on top of. Small operational choices, overlooked technical details, and untested assumptions about anonymity were already accumulating in the background, long before anyone realized they would matter. At this stage, the people involved believed they had time. They believed the systems protecting them were solid, that the walls they had built were high enough, that nobody was paying close enough attention to notice the seams. That confidence would later prove to be their first real vulnerability, not a technical flaw, but a psychological one. And that is often how cases like this actually begin. Not with a raid or an explosion, but with a long stretch of silence, a silence that, only in hindsight, was already full of warning signs nobody was watching for yet. As momentum built, the rise marked the moment things stopped being small. How the operation grew larger and more dangerous over time. What had started as a modest operation began attracting attention, first from a small circle of insiders, then from a much wider audience who saw an opportunity too large to ignore. Growth like this rarely happens by accident. Behind the scenes, systems were being scaled, processes were being refined, and the operation was becoming more sophisticated by the week. Every success reinforced the belief that the approach was working, and every close call that went unnoticed only deepened that false sense of security. This is the stage where most similar stories start to resemble a real business more than a crime: structure, hierarchy, division of labor, quality control. The people running things were no longer improvising. They were operating, and operating well enough that outsiders were starting to take notice. But scale always comes with a cost. The larger something grows, the more moving parts there are to manage, the more people who need to be trusted, and the more opportunities for a single mistake to unravel everything. The Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage, was entering exactly that kind of territory. Every operation like this eventually reaches a point where the first real mistakes start to surface, and for the Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage, the cracks begin to show was that turning point. Early mistakes and warning signs investigators started to notice. Nothing catastrophic happened yet, not obviously anyway, but the small inconsistencies were beginning to add up in ways that would matter enormously later. Investigators who study cases like this describe a familiar pattern: overconfidence breeds carelessness. People who have gotten away with something for long enough start to believe the rules that apply to everyone else do not apply to them. A shortcut here, a reused credential there, a moment of complacency that would have been unthinkable at the very beginning. None of these mistakes seemed significant in isolation. That is what makes them so dangerous. A single overlooked detail rarely brings down an operation on its own, but a pattern of them, accumulating quietly over time, builds exactly the kind of trail that a patient investigator can eventually follow home. And somewhere, almost certainly without realizing it yet, that trail had already begun. The gap between confidence and reality was widening, even as everything on the surface still looked entirely under control. By the time closing in began, the balance of power had already started to shift, even if nobody involved in the Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage, could see it yet. How investigators built their case piece by piece. Behind the scenes, investigators were doing the unglamorous, methodical work that rarely makes it into the headlines: cross-referencing timestamps, tracing financial flows, matching digital fingerprints against a growing list of suspects. This kind of investigation is rarely fast, and it is almost never linear. For every promising lead, there are a dozen dead ends. But patience, in cases like this, tends to be the deciding factor, and law enforcement had exactly the kind of patience that criminal operations count on running out first. Piece by piece, the anonymity that once felt unbreakable began showing seams. A server location here. A financial transaction there. A username reused just once, on the wrong platform, at the wrong time. None of it looked dramatic from the inside, but from the outside, a very different picture was coming into focus. By the end of this chapter, investigators were no longer chasing shadows. They had a target, a timeline, and enough evidence to start planning what came next. The takedown is the moment the Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage, stopped being an investigation and became a headline. The moment everything came crashing down. Everything that had been building quietly for months, sometimes years, arrived all at once, in the kind of moment that redefines how the entire story gets told afterward. For the people on the receiving end, there was rarely any warning. One ordinary day looked exactly like the one before it, right up until it did not. Agents moving in, warrants being executed, devices seized before anything could be deleted or destroyed. The element of surprise, carefully protected throughout the entire investigation, was the whole point, and it worked. What happens in these moments often determines everything that follows legally. Evidence gathered in the first few hours can shape years of prosecution. Statements made in a moment of shock and confusion can become the foundation of an entire case. It is tempting to think of a takedown as the end of the story. In reality, it is usually just the beginning of a very different one, the legal, financial, and personal fallout that stretches on long after the arrests make the news. In the aftermath of the fallout, the consequences of the Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage, rippled outward far beyond the people directly involved. What happened in the immediate aftermath? Copycats emerged, imitators tried to fill the vacuum left behind, and an entire ecosystem that had grown around the original operation was forced to reckon with just how exposed it truly was. For the people at the center of the story, the fallout rarely ends when the arrest does. Legal proceedings drag on. Assets get seized. Reputations, relationships, and entire futures get reshaped by decisions made in a matter of months or even weeks, years earlier. There is also a broader ripple effect worth paying attention to: the way institutions, platforms, and entire industries respond. Security policies get rewritten. New monitoring systems get implemented. Lessons that should have been obvious from the start finally get taken seriously, usually only after the damage is already done. None of this undoes what happened. But it does shape everything that comes after, for the people involved, and for anyone else who might have been tempted to follow the same path. Every story like the Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage, eventually arrives at the same fundamental question: what does the lessons learned actually teach us? What this case reveals about security, power, and consequences. Strip away the headlines, the arrests, and the dramatic details, and what remains is a pattern that shows up again and again in cases just like this one. Confidence, left unchecked, becomes carelessness. Anonymity, no matter how sophisticated, is never as permanent as it feels in the moment. And the gap between believing you are untouchable and actually being untouchable is almost always smaller than people think, right up until the moment it collapses entirely. For investigators, cases like this reinforce a simple truth: patience and persistence tend to outlast even the most carefully constructed operations. For everyone else, they serve as a reminder of just how thin the line really is between getting away with something and getting caught by it. In the end, the Dark Overlord, the hacker syndicate that held Netflix and hospitals hostage, joins a long list of stories that all seem to end the same way, not because the people involved were unusually reckless, but because the illusion of control, however convincing it feels at the time, was never quite as solid as it appeared.